Thank you very much. I won't put this on just yet. Because you've already heard some things from me and I'm not able to do a live software demo, what I'm going to do is to show you a short video of 4 minutes, which is an EMIF project video that gives you a better feeling for the project as a whole. I'm then going to give a roughly 5-6 minute presentation, a bit more detail on how we have dealt with the governance aspects of data sharing in EMIF. And then I'm going to, with Michelle with me, we're going to be more open for discussion and questions because you've sat a lot this morning. And I think if we keep it short and let you have more interaction time, that'll be nicer for you, and we might also catch up a bit on the time so that you get lunch eventually. All right? Is that okay? So first the video. Let me see which one is the video icon. Oh, that one. There we are. Okay. Let's just see. I'm not sure about the volume. Let's go for it. Oh, now. Do you know how we turn the volume? Ah. Let me go back to the beginning.
Access to this medical information. The mission of the European Medical Information Framework, known as EMIF, is to improve identification, access and assessment, and reuse of health data within the European Union. With this mission in mind, access to descriptive information about the data available in EMIF was expanded to researchers beyond EMIF. 2 tracks in the EMIF architecture support 2 European data types: electronic health records, which include routine healthcare data from general practices and hospitals, and cohort datasets, which include data for specific research communities. Let's explore how you, as a researcher, can utilize electronic health record data. You may have a specific population-based study in mind. You'd like to utilize the real-world data accessible via the EMIF platform. Your first stop is the EMIF homepage, where you can create an account and request access to the electronic health record community. Browse the data catalog containing all participating data sources to select the best candidates for your research question. Use a form to ask a simple question or an advanced query tool to assess data availability. Create a short research proposal outlining your study aims and the candidate data sources. Submit this proposal to EMIF. Upon approval, EMIF will provide support for the negotiation process with the data custodians. Develop a full study protocol using EMIF templates. You will need to build a research team, including an epidemiologist, a clinical expert, a statistician, and a data analyst. The data custodians can also assist with protocol development. After assigning your study an EMIF ID, EMIF will assist you by creating a document sharing repository on Teamwork and a project management account on Tasca. Once the governance boards from each data source have approved the study, a data sharing agreement is signed. You will receive an EMIF letter of approval to conduct your study. Multi-database studies are challenging because data sources have different structures and use different coding systems. EMIF supports harmonization using 2 approaches. The first approach is to harmonize the source data on a study-by-study basis. This involves mapping the individual source vocabularies for all events of interest to a common code. EMIF supports this by providing access to the Code Mapper tool from the IMI Advanced project. If you need to take this approach for your study, consult with your research team's clinical expert and data custodians. The second approach is to map the database to the OMAP Common Data Model. In this approach, the full data set is already harmonized with respect to structure and vocabularies. The research team then creates a document which describes how to produce shareable analytical data sets from the harmonized data. This document also specifies the statistical analysis that will be conducted. Using the data extraction and statistical analysis plan, the study lead creates a script that runs locally against the data to produce an anonymized analytical data set. This data set is then uploaded into the private remote research environment for quality control and analysis. In the private remote research environment, you can perform statistical analyses on the data set using common statistical packages, for example, Stata, SAS, or R, and share results with your team. Once analyses are completed, you might prepare a manuscript for publication in a peer-reviewed journal in which you would be able to acknowledge all EMIF partners of the study and include data owners as co-authors. We encourage you to advance your epidemiological research in European populations by utilizing the EMIF platform.
Good. Well, I hope that gives you a little more insight. That video, but a lot more information, is on the EMIF website, so please do take a look. Let me now just give you a few moments on the EMIF Code of Practice stuff. I'm not going to do all of these slides, but like all good events, I'm sure you'll have access to the slides later, so that you can see all the slides I'm skipping. But I'm just going to keep it a bit short and sweet in the interest of time, and if I'm lucky, it behaves. Okay, good. So one of the challenges when we scale up data sharing and seek to do this at a European level is we're starting to encourage data sharing, if you like, between strangers. Data sharing sometimes takes place today between academic communities who otherwise work together, put in joint grant proposals, and share in all sorts of ways. Or they are sponsored through a clinical research study, for example, a pharma company or a medical device company is acting as the sponsor, so they form a bridge to connect data sources together with a financial bond. What we're looking at when we scale up is sharing among strangers, and that means the trust relationship is absolutely vital, and it'll be interesting for us maybe to discuss after I've finished how you have encountered trust issues or non-issues in the work you're doing. But here on one slide is really all of the key ingredients, and I'll only amplify a few of them in the next few slides. One is that we do require as part of EMIF that the research that is undertaken through EMIF channels is for bona fide purposes, and I'm going to elaborate bona fide, so just hold on to that thought, and bona fide research organizations. For those people who have data and wish to make it available, it's important that there is transparency about the data so that anybody who uses it isn't surprised and doesn't end up being misled when they work up a plan to use somebody's data. It's important that anybody who has a research study in mind is able to be very precise about what it is that they're intending to do, and that between the research user and the data source there is an understanding of who is responsible for ensuring that the ethics and consent applies. The data source may already have consent and ethics approval for a broad family of research endeavors, and the data user, the research user, may simply have to be inside that umbrella, and they don't need a special additional ethics approval. Sometimes they will. What we do require is that the parties work that out in advance. There needs to be protection of data subjects. You know that. The data source will already have some means of securing the data. Part of understanding when you share data is that you share in advance and agree what is the reciprocal protection to be provided by the research user, so that the person sharing the data doesn't introduce a compromise in what they've already promised their own data subjects. It's necessary as part of sharing data to agree in advance how acknowledgement or reward takes place. Is there a financial transaction, or, as mentioned in the video, is there a co-authorship agreement? Agreeing in advance, not at the end when the paper is about to be published. Agreeing in advance what the authorship policy is important in our experience. Compliance and audit is also vital. Parties who use data have to be prepared, if necessary, to expose an audit trail to an independent assessor to confirm that they have complied with the rules of engagement that they signed. If they're not prepared to be transparent in an investigation of, for example, a breach or a misconduct investigation, they shouldn't be sharing data in the first place. And so these are the kinds of principles that we have developed. So just to come to a couple of elaboration points, bona fide research. We have spent, I don't know, 2.5 years chewing over what we think represents a way of describing, I wish I could say formally defining, it's probably more accurate to say describing, what might be considered bona fide research. Its objective is to discover new knowledge intended for the public good and to be made publicly accessible. And a bona fide research organization is one that is appointed or accredited or funded to undertake bona fide research and or has made public its commitment to adhere to recognized research governance principles. You will notice that this definition of a bona fide research organization deliberately makes no mention of commercial versus non-commercial purposes. It only specifies that the intent of the organization is to conduct bona fide research. There is supplementary text, I'm not going to go into it all, that research doesn't have to be the only thing the organization does. For example, universities, which you might think are bona fide, they teach as well in their spare time when they're not doing research. Pharma companies make drugs and sell them in their spare time, so it doesn't have to be the only thing you do. And of course, we've got a variety of understandings of what we mean by new knowledge. That could mean it's corroboration or refuting existing knowledge rather than absolutely blue sky knowledge. And also recognizing that you don't necessarily publish all the way along, but there is an end point intent to publish. And then we require that. So the main principles of our charter, and I'll let this be my last slide, is that the platform can only be used for assessing the feasibility of a study and conducting research by bona fide research organizations. That data sources will always have autonomy over what data they make available and for what kinds of research. As an example of that, I mean, they might say they're happy with drug discovery research, they're not happy with safety studies, or they might say we're happy with both of those, we're absolutely not prepared for our data to be used for market analysis type of research. We want to know, and that becomes then a precondition for using the data source. The data source always has the right to determine the ethical acceptability and scientific validity. We do not say that because a bona fide research organization wants to undertake research on your data, that they should be automatically given that right. Many data sources have approval processes where they assess whether the requester is making a meaningful scientific proposal. They may assess the intended statistical power of the study before they grant access. We're not taking away those rights of the data source, but we also require that transparency, and there are more slides in here about that transparency. We place obligations on the user, the research user, to adhere to the policies of the data source. They also have to adhere to our ECOP, which is the EMIF Code of Practice, which has a large number of clauses. It's not yet public, but we're working on a public version of that over the summer. And they have to acknowledge the sources of the data they've used, etc. And they can only use the data for the purposes that they have declared. So we require pre-declaration of the purpose. That applies even to things like feasibility queries, to say, I'm looking to assess if data sources have the right patients for a particular area of research. They have to specify that research, and we would look to see which data sources have agreed to having their data used for that kind of research. For example, if it was a market analysis study, only the data sources that have agreed to market analysis research would become queryable in that environment. So I'm going to stop there. What I will admit to you is that what I have described to you is a written policy. It is not automated in the tooling as yet, but that is an ambition we would like to get to in future research, hopefully under Michelle's umbrella in the future, because we need to make this slick and efficient so nobody is burdened with heavy bureaucracy, but at the same time we have to assure all stakeholders that good practices are being upheld and that research in Europe is undertaken in trustworthy ways. So I'll stop there. Michelle and I are now open for questions. Michelle, we've got a whole load of chairs we can sit at. We might stand, depending on your mood. We're open for questions, and Jem, whenever you're ready, you close curtains and then everybody goes to lunch. Okay. Many more slides for you to look at on another day.
Two questions. One is that at the moment the EU projects, projects are very clear they like a return on their investment, which means that all projects, even though it's research, we now have to write effectively a business case going forwards. Would you, in terms of EMIF charter, see that as an impediment to applying for data from your source? And the second question is a more prosaic one. With Brexit coming down the road towards UK, does that mean the UK data files then becomes separated from the EMIF programme?
Okay, these are tough questions. I think that one of the when people share data today, they sometimes do it in very informal ways and casual ways without the kinds of robustness I've described. Now, what we are trying to establish, or what we've tried to do in EMIF, is to propose a scalable pan-European infrastructure. Now, we're not saying, and I don't think it would be at all appropriate for us to say, all data sharing in old-fashioned ways through mates and friends and bending the rules must now stop, and that this is the only channel. But we believe that without a robust trust ecosystem, we will not scale to a European level federated environment. So I think it's a temporary phase of existing practice coexisting with a new higher grade practice. I would like to think over time everybody migrates to higher standards. So I don't see an impediment. I see an opportunity to grow the capability to do big scale research, but it has to be done in a trustworthy way. It's rather like data protection. Data protection, information security for electronic health records is sky higher than applies to paper records. If you've walked in hospitals and seen trolleys outside a clinic room in the corridor with stacks of paper files, how hard is it to pick up one and go off to the lavatory and read it and then put it back later? It's really easy. You can't do that with electronic data. When we move to another paradigm, the standards are sometimes set to a different level. And I think the European scale paradigm demands setting things to a higher level. Will Brexit make a difference? I hope not, because as far as I understand it, almost everyone I speak to in the scientific community wants to be part of Europe. And being part of Europe means, actually in this case, having GDPR compliant privacy protection rules in your country. The Wellcome Trust and other bodies have lobbied government very strongly that UK law should enshrine the same principles as the GDPR. So it is extremely likely that UK will be considered by the EU as an equivalent protection country, and therefore data sharing should be able to occur seamlessly. Now, I'm not Theresa May. I'm not going to talk about electronic border controls and trusted traders, but maybe we could create something that the scientific community and the public are willing to trust, even in isolated Britain. Of course, you can all disagree with that.
Yeah,
you could be right, but I think we have to let that unfold. And the question is whether that set of barriers occurs on every data sharing moment, or whether it occurs when institutions join groups. So maybe a large university or a large company only has to go through a small hurdle once, and then they have some years ahead of enjoyable data use. Maybe. To be found out, I guess.
I have a general question, maybe a practical question. You got me enthusiastic because obviously being a researcher, applied researcher you could say, I suppose I share the sentiment of many colleagues of mine who think more data is useful, right? But obviously, to generate hypotheses, to test hypotheses, the data is good. What would it cost? I mean, is there budget element involved, or is it like free? Because one of the issues would be a researcher has limited funds, but in applications, grant applications, you have to sort of know upfront how much these data sharing might cost.
Michelle, do you have any ideas on that or not? I was going to just briefly mention that, Tina and co did some business projections. EMIF is winding down as a project. We are not creating a sustained federation, but Michelle is going to be creating a sustained federation very, very soon. So, there were a lot of budget calculations, but they were mainly around charging models to the pharma sector. Do you want to say any more about how you picture I know I'm landing you in it, but you deserve it. Do you want to say anything about?
But I think it's very much in line with what you described, Deepak, and also in other initiatives is a bit the paradigm that.
I think you may have to use. Do you need the microphone for the recording? Yeah.
All right. So I just wanted to confirm that what Deepak was saying is the general thought is that indeed if it would be pharma-initiated research questions or so, that indeed there would be a compensation for that according to the transfer of value and all applicable rules that we have to adhere to. But that equally so, if it would be purely coming from academic communities, that the default position would be that it's under an open science collaboration. Although maybe there are indeed variants possible, but this is a bit the big lines of thought.
Okay. And second quick question. Examples speak louder than the description, I think. I'd like to, are there any examples of successful data and research projects that have used this data, or is this something that's in the works?
You're talking about the governance aspect or the use of it?
The use of it, yes.
Oh, that is the results.
Yeah, so actually, there on the EMIF side, this was of course also a moving target because of the code of practice was not available as of day one. But in total, on the population level data, there were 12 use cases implemented under the EMIF umbrella. So, and basically, again, at different stages of maturity of the code of practice.
So in the meantime, I've just gone to the EMIF page and just quickly popped up the publications tab, and all you need to do is to just get a feeling. I know you're not reading it this fast. All you're doing is getting a feeling for the volume, all right? And the early ones are more rudimentary uses of distributed data, but as you get towards the top, the more recent ones, and I'm a bit surprised we don't seem to have got 2017 up yet. But actually we're in 18 now, so we'll have to tell the team. What we're starting to see is more and more publications that have actually used the distributed data environment. And these are genuine scientific breakthroughs. So these are real science done using data. It's not informatics publications, but clinical research publications.
Anyone else?
Your chapter, it's based on
Yes, we did. We actually looked at a very large number of data sharing agreements. We looked at a large number of legislative instruments so that we tried to cover the territory quite well. I mean, when we started developing it, the GDPR was still an Article 29 dream, so we didn't actually have it initially. We started, of course, with the 95 directive and went on from there. But as the GDPR drafts or emergent materials came out, we cross-checked. But in fact, when it comes to this kind of research use, the GDPR doesn't introduce many brand new concepts. They were mostly in the 95 directive. The things that would be more punishing, if you like, more stringent, would be on a data source that has previously collected consent from its data subject to have its data. It may need to revisit its consent and make sure it's comfortable. There are issues around pseudonymization that may have implications, but neither of those are specifically things that EMIF touches. What we have done, for example, in the Code of Practice, is stated that any linkage that has to be undertaken using identifiable or pseudonymous data needs to be undertaken by ideally the data source or one of the data sources before it sits in an EMIF space, or the EMIF space has to be held by a trusted third party who has permission to process pseudonymous data. So we've tried to safeguard a little bit that area. But you know, the GDPR national implementations around things like pseudonymization are still to be discovered. As I'm sure you may discuss that tomorrow. I don't know if that's your plan, but you know, those are topics where we can't be categorical yet. Is that fair?
Yeah, you use different agreements to build up.
Fine. Okay.
How do you recommend a medical center to work with its compliant environment, and on the other end, the EMIF research, open access sharing? So if I come in my Horizon cardiology project that I mentioned, near the patients that we currently treat for heart failure, and I need to use that data in relation to our population studies where we collect for many years information on the same type of individuals, and I would like to install a package near my compliant environment. I'm seeing a gun spec go away with this software because you endanger now the status of our ISO 27001. So,
well, I don't know if you recall, but the diagram I presented earlier this morning showed that the both for the EHR4CR project and for EMIF, it's not necessarily the case that you connect a federated query environment to the native data. You can create a separate physical or virtual repository.
but then you replicate the data. You have to replicate your data.
Well, that's your choice. If you can protect it by means of a virtualized environment, then you don't have to replicate the data. You know, do you know what I mean? You know,
the systems we have on the hospital side basically don't match the criteria which are necessary in the research. So
what
so
I mean is that if you've got 10 fields in a database, let's keep it really 10 fields, 5 of them are relatively personally identifying, and 5 of them are boring clinical data, let's say. They don't identify anyone. They're really very numeric values and things like that. You know, you've got 2 choices. You could say, I've got 10 columns in my table. I'm going to create a new table with only 5 columns and duplicate all those 5 columns for 250 million patients. Or you say, I'm going to build a security model that masks 5 for certain kinds of user, so the user is only ever aware of 5, but you've avoided duplication of the data. That's a computer science alternative option. Virtually, the research user is only ever seeing 5 columns. in the table. How you implement that is, and that's issues around how robust is your security, what's your performance like. If your 10-column database is sitting on a server that's really busy all the time, you actually may not have CPU capability to allow remote querying as well. So it may serve you to have a separate physical machine with the 5 columns so that the rest of the world can play at annoying times of the day without affecting your own CPU performance. But that's a personal choice. EMIF doesn't go there. It specifies the rules. Michelle can only see 5 columns. That's what we're saying. How you deliver that 5 columns is your technology choice. Michelle, does that sound fair, or do you want to elaborate a bit?
Yeah, just maybe, oh, sorry, I pressed a button here, I hope, right. So even one step further, because actually a lot of these, even these research databases are completely isolated. So in fact, from a tooling perspective, there is not a need to have a real connection towards the outside world. So the model can also work with actually basically completely standalone, defining your analysis script and handing it over to the respective research center who launches it then standalone on that instance. So that's in the case where there would be no physical connection. Of course, it's equally possible to truly have a physical connection towards that anonymized research database, but it's not a prerequisite.
Thank you. That's a very good point. Okay. Hunger has taken over, understandably.
Thank you very much, Deepak and Michelle.